Excellent. Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give one more minute before we actually start. We have 65 attendees so far, and looking forward to a great event here with Mr. Jon Williams. So we'll just give it another minute before we get started. Thank you. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. It's now 2:01, and I believe we are up to now 87 attendees, which is awesome. Thank you so much. This is going to be a great event, especially over the discussion of the topic that Mr. Jon Williams is going to discuss with us. That topic has to do with the HUBZone rules and the current changes. And I believe a lot of this has to do with, for example, the annual recertification component, the revised definition of what an employee actually is, the legacy HUBZone employee provision, and long-term investment provision for HUBZone and principal of their principal offices. Jon, please take over. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome, and thank you, James, and thanks to NVSBC and also to the HUBZone Council for both being on this presentation with me. I really appreciate both the NVSBC and the HUBZone Council. We work a lot with both organizations. They're fantastic advocates for SDVOSBs and for HUBZone firms and really for all small businesses. So really honored and glad to be a part of this event today with the NVSBC and the HUBZone Council. And as James said, I'm going to take you through the latest developments with the HUBZone program. I am a partner with the law firm of PilieroMazza, and we represent many government contractors, all shapes and sizes, but we do focus on the federal small business programs. And one of those programs, HUBZone, is really near and dear to my heart. I've been working with the HUBZone program for many years. I'm a board member with the HUBZone Council and really a strong supporter of both what the SBA is doing through the HUBZone program and also all the businesses out there that are working in these historically underutilized business zones and employing people that live there and really trying to fulfill the important mission of that program. And like I mentioned, PilieroMazza is our firm. Just a brief slide here on your screen about us. If you don't know us, be happy to give you some more information about our law firm and the different things that we do in helping both government contractors and also commercial businesses. So feel free to reach out to me or visit us on the web if you'd like to learn more about our firm. And before I turn the slide here to get rolling, please don't hesitate to use the chat box on your screen here to pop in questions, or I guess maybe it's the questions box. I also have a chat, so don't hesitate to fire away. I will try to answer them as I go. I'm also hoping to save a few minutes at the end of the hour to answer questions. And any that I don't get to, I will try to follow up with you after the webinar to answer your question. I know that the HUBZone rules, even though they've been simplified, it can still be very challenging to follow, and I imagine there'll be a lot of questions unique to your specific situation. So go ahead and fire away as we dive into the HUBZone program here and what's new. And really to talk about the latest developments with the HUBZone program, we need to start with the rule changes that went into effect a little bit over a year and a half ago at this point in December 2019, because those are not necessarily recent changes, but I think we are still all living with them, getting used to them, understanding what they mean and how they impact you all as HUBZone businesses. And then there also have been some, I would say, evolving guidance from SBA about how to interpret and apply those rules. So let's just get a foundation here with some of the key changes in the 2019 HUBZone rule changes. As James mentioned, they've now moved to annual recertification, and they made some tweaks to the definition of an employee. They added a new definition of what it means to attempt to maintain compliance with the HUBZone program. They added a new provision on what we call legacy HUBZone employees, and also a new long-term investment provision for principal offices. So those are just highlights. I'm going to drill down on each of them as we move along here. So starting with annual recertification, I think this was one of the key changes in the rules. It's really designed to make the program and the rules more user-friendly, more business-friendly, give you more certainty that as a HUBZone business, that was one of the big challenges that I think SBA and Congress and we heard about the program, is that under the old rules, you had to be eligible every time you submitted a proposal and won an award of a HUBZone contract. And that was unique to the HUBZone program, and it made it challenging. It made it challenging for contracting officers, and it made it challenging for the firms, especially on the date of award requirement, because you don't know when the government's going to award a contract, and it's, you also can't predict when one of your employees might resign, or you need to let them go, or they decide to move. So there was a lot of uncertainty caused by that, and I think they made a great step to provide more certainty by moving to this annual recertification requirement. So now you have to recertify your eligibility once a year on your anniversary date. And if you recertify on that date, then you're eligible to bid on and win HUBZone contracts for the next year. So when you're submitting a proposal for a HUBZone contract, you're not certifying that you are HUBZone eligible on that particular date. Your certification relates back to your anniversary date when you had your annual recertification. So that's really the key date every year now for HUBZone firms under these new rules. And because the rules took effect in December 2019, the last year, 2020, was really the first year for these new annual recertification rules. But then COVID happened, and SBA decided to give HUBZone firms the option of deferring their annual recertification to 2021. And just anecdotally, based on the companies that we work with, I think most firms elected to defer their annual recertification to 2021. So for many HUBZone businesses, this year, 2021, is the first time that they're going through this new annual recertification process. And so, and that means it's also the first time I'm seeing clients go through that process. And so we've been learning a lot about how SBA is handling the recertification and the ways that they're interpreting the requirements by how they're handling these annual recertifications. And so we're going to talk about that as we move through the slides. So the way that they're doing it is the SBA is providing a notice to the firm 30 days prior to their anniversary date. And the notice tells the company you have up to 30 days after your recertification date, your anniversary date, to complete your recertification. So you really have a 60-day window then I know we've had some clients that have not received that initial notice. So, you know, when we get to the recommendations part, one of my recommendations is to make sure you know what your anniversary date is. And if there's a lack of clarity about that, reach out to SBA. And if you are approaching your anniversary date, that 30-day mark before your anniversary date, and you have not heard from SBA, reach out to them. Because you want to make sure you know that you're in your recertification window. There's also been confusion about what exactly does this 60-day period mean? Why are they giving you 30 days before and up to 30 days after? And some companies have believed that whatever date you choose within that 60-day window is the date that they're going to use to judge your annual recertification. And I think that's actually a reasonable interpretation, because why else would they give you 30 days after and let you do it 30 days before? So yeah, I think some firms have been confused by that, but what SBA has said is that even though they're giving companies this 60-day window to complete the recertification, they're judging your eligibility as of your anniversary date. So it's not the date you decide to submit your recertification, it's the anniversary date. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, why are they letting people do it up to 30 days before their anniversary date if they're going to judge you on your anniversary date? I'm not sure I follow that, but I've heard enough confusion from firms that I wanted to point this out. And that my understanding is that regardless of the fact they're giving you this 60-day period, when you recertify, you need to make sure you're eligible based on your anniversary date. And then I have a question that's come in here about the 20% residency requirement for a recertification. That is an actual rule at this point. To the question, it's not just a proposed rule, it's an actual rule. I am going to spend some time on that, but it is important to note here, this is sort of the bottom line takeaway for how it works. When you get to your recertification, your anniversary date, you're going to be judged based on either 20% or 35%. And that is based on whether you are performing a HUBZone contract or not at that point. And I will talk about this in more depth as we move along. And if you have more questions around, we get a lot of questions on the 20% versus 35%. So feel free to send some more in if you have them. So just a little bit more about annual recertification. So because they're now judging everyone's status at this annual recertification, the anniversary date, then that has eliminated the need for you to send in a notice to SBA anytime you might have a change in, like, let's say an employee leaves and you fall below the 35% or something like that. In the past, you were expected to promptly notify SBA of any changes that could impact your HUBZone eligibility, but now they say you don't need to tell us because we're going to judge you once a year at that anniversary date. So if there are some changes that happen throughout the year, that's okay. We're going to judge you once you get to your next anniversary date. There are a couple exceptions to that, though. So I wanted to point out here that if you went through an acquisition or a merger, then they want you to notify them within 30 days because they want to be able to determine if you're still going to be a HUBZone eligible business based on the acquisition or the merger. And they also want you to tell them if you fall below 20% HUBZone employees. So that has really become the floor for companies that are performing on HUBZone contracts. You can't go below 20% or you would need to notify SBA. But those are the only two exceptions when you would need to notify SBA during your year. Otherwise, you would be informing them on your anniversary date through your recertification if you're still meeting all the requirements or not. Next, I'm going to go into a definition of employee, which is so critical for the HUBZone program. Obviously, the requirements are really geared around employees and who qualifies as an employee. So it's really important that you understand how they're going to judge your employees. So what I've got in the first bullet here is essentially coming right from the SBA's regulation. So they're going to consider an employee to be someone that's employed on a full-time, part-time, or other basis, as long as they work a minimum of 40 hours during the 4-week period immediately prior to the relevant date. And what I mean by relevant date, it's either your application date or it's your annual recertification, your anniversary date. So it's the key numbers there, 40 hours and 4-week period. But there's still a lot of confusion about what is that 4-week period. And it was, I think, much more confusing under the old rules. So the new rules, I think, clear this up, but not every, I think this is something that everyone is still getting used to because these rules are new. So the SBA will judge the 4-week period based on this second bullet, that the SBA will review your payroll records for the most recently completed pay periods that cover the 4-week period immediately prior to the date of the application or the date of recertification. So the key there is what I highlighted. They have to be the most recently completed pay periods. And so I've given you an example here of an anniversary date. If your HUBZone anniversary date was today, then, and you have payroll every 2 weeks, then the 4 weeks of most recently completed payroll for you would be the last 2 weeks of June and the first 2 weeks of July. You would not use the pay period from July 15 to July 30, even though that covers your anniversary date. July 21 falls in that pay period. It's not a completed pay period as of July 21st. As of July 21st, it still has 9 days left, or whatever it is. So, so you have to make sure that you're tracking the most recently completed pay periods that cover a 4-week period immediately prior to your anniversary date. And I know there's been some confusion around that. So you need to zero in on those 4 weeks of completed payroll immediately prior to your anniversary date. To be considered a HUBZone employee, so then not just an employee, but a HUBZone employee, the employee has to be living in a HUBZone, obviously. So, I mean, that's easy enough to tell. You go to the SBA map on the web and you pop in their address, and the SBA map tool is very easy to follow. It'll tell you if it's a HUBZone eligible location, or if it's a redesignated area, or it has some other status associated with it. They have different designations, and it's very easy to follow. So that's, I'm sure, already a standard part of what you're doing for your HUBZone compliance, is using the map tool to look up the addresses for your employees. But it's not enough to just look up the address of your employees and get their lease to make sure they're actually living at the address they told you, or their driver's license. You also need to know, when did they start living in the HUBZone? Because under the new rules, SBA has emphasized that a HUBZone employee does not count unless they've been living in a HUBZone for at least 180 days prior to your application or your recertification date. So, I mean, they would say in the past, they've always judged it like this. I would say, I think in the past, there's been some flexibility that if your employee had moved into a HUBZone only a few months ago, but you could show an intent to remain living in the HUBZone indefinitely because they bought their house or they signed a long-term lease, and in my experience, SBA would accept that. But they're now saying there aren't any exceptions to this. So it's a bright line cutoff point, 180 days prior to your recertification date. So if you are recertifying today, and you have someone who worked 40 hours during that relevant 4-week period that we were just talking about, they're going to count as an employee. But they might not count as a HUBZone employee unless they have been living in a HUBZone for at least 180 days prior to today, your certification date. They do not have to work for you for that entire 180-day period. They have, that can be also confusing. I've had some clients wonder if that's a requirement. So these are two different requirements then, that they have to work at least 40 hours in that relevant 4-week period to count as an employee. But to count as a HUBZone employee, they had to be living in a HUBZone for at least 180 days prior to your certification date. And we have had some clients that have been able to take advantage of this rule that says that if you have a US resident that's temporarily working overseas, that they could still count as a HUBZone employee if you can show that they own their home or they're continuing to pay rent at the HUBZone location. But it's really important, as we go to the next slide, it's just really important that you start tracking when your HUBZone employees first started living in a HUBZone. You know, I think you want to have a spreadsheet of all your people and where you're, you know, and this is a living document that you're updating it, you know, at least on a monthly basis or maybe more often as you have people who are coming and going. And one of the columns on that spreadsheet, the information you're tracking, is you need to track the date they first started living at their HUBZone address. And then you'll know if they were there for 180 days as of your next recertification, whether you're allowed to count them as a HUBZone employee or not. So now I moved over to attempting to maintain compliance here. This is some flexibility that applies when you might dip below the 35% HUBZone employee requirement. You have that flexibility if you can show that you are attempting to maintain compliance, and that's been in the rules for a while, but in the new rules they've clarified what they mean by that. And so here's how we break it down. You can only attempt to maintain compliance if you're performing HUBZone contracts, and I have to emphasize that that does not include subcontracts. We've gotten that question a lot. We've talked directly with SBA about it. They gave us very thoughtful response on that and pointed to the underlying statutory requirements. So even if they wanted to expand it to subcontracts based on the way the law is currently written, they don't think they can. So the bottom line is, you need to be performing on a HUBZone prime contract at the time of your annual recertification to take advantage of this rule. If all you have are HUBZone subcontracts, like where maybe a prime is taking credit for you towards their HUBZone goals, that will not count. You're going to be judged on the 35% standard. But if you are performing a HUBZone prime contract as of your anniversary date, then you don't have to meet the 35% requirement. You get to meet the 20% requirement. So you have more flexibility if you can show that you're performing on a HUBZone contract. But I also want to emphasize that it's not just the 20% requirement. You also need to be able to demonstrate to the SBA that you are making substantive and documented efforts to hire more HUBZone employees. So, you know, that could be offers of employment, ads, job fairs. I mean, that's not exhaustive. It could, you know, whatever you can document to show that you are trying to hire more HUBZone employees. You need to be able to do that. And if you can do that and you're performing on a HUBZone prime contract, then you can recertify even if you're below 35%. You just have to be at least 20% HUBZone resident employees. So that's the whole 20 versus 35%. You never have to meet both. It's one or the other. And you know, the default is 35%. That's what you have to meet to get into the program. But if you are performing a HUBZone prime contract on any of your anniversary dates, then your number drops down to 20%. You just have to meet the 20% requirement. So based on what we've talked about so far, I want to just kind of pause here and recap and give you some tips for your annual recertification. And like I said before, you want to know your HUBZone anniversary date and know that SBA is reaching out to firms 30 days prior to that anniversary date to start the recertification process. So if you haven't heard from them, reach out to SBA. They're really good about getting back to you on this, and we've found them to be very responsive, because there can be confusion. You know, they might be tracking your recertification, your anniversary date, based on a date that you didn't realize, because you might have thought that you submitted some information to them that constituted a recertification on a different date in the past. But they're going to use the date you got into the program. That becomes your anniversary date going forward. But I know some clients that have been unsure if that's the right date or not. You can go into the SBA's dynamic small business search website and look yourself up, and that lists the HUBZone anniversary date. But if you're not sure, reach out to SBA, have them confirm your anniversary date, and make sure that you got the message to start your recertification process when it's 30 days before. I suggest to all of our clients, you should calendar that 4-week of pay periods that's going to be most recently completed as of your anniversary date. This is one of the real advantages of the new rules. We don't have to guess anymore. We don't have to wonder, when am I going to get an award, or when am I submitting a proposal, and how do I measure the 4 weeks prior to the proposal or the award date. This year and for every year going forward, the 4-week period that is going to be the end-all be-all for your HUBZone certification. It's that 4 weeks of completed payroll that are completed most recently before your anniversary date. That's the 4 weeks that matters every year. So you should have that, like a big star on your calendar, so as you're getting up to that 4-week period, that's the period that's going to really matter in terms of making sure who's working 40 hours and who's living in a HUBZone and who lived in a HUBZone for at least 180 days prior to the anniversary date. All of that is going to build around this 4-week period. So you really want to plan in advance and not be caught off guard when you're going through recertification that you didn't have your stuff together, because you know that 4-week period. So really help, I think, very beneficial to plan in advance. And same for that 180-day period. Since you know your anniversary date, or if you don't, you'll confirm it with SBA, back up 180 days from that date and calendar 180 days prior to your anniversary. And then you know what your cutoff is for hiring new employees based on when they first started living in a HUBZone. If you want them to count for your next annual recertification, then they had to be living in a HUBZone prior to whatever that 180-day mark is. So I think that's also a good date to be tracking in your system. And then you may not know for sure far in advance if you'll be performing on a HUBZone prime contract or not, but because lots can happen with contracts. But you should be, as you're approaching your anniversary date, you should be targeting, am I going to be at 20% or 35%, and what does that mean for us for that 4-week period, and how many people are working 40 hours, et cetera. That's another critical data point to make sure you're tracking as you're looking at your recertification. All right, so next I want to talk about legacy employees a little bit. This is one of the new rules that they put in place back in December 2019. We've never had this before, and I think it had a lot of promise when they first implemented it, you know, there's a real advantage here because the purpose of this rule is to let you continue counting your employees as HUBZone employees even after they no longer live in a HUBZone. So the idea is, you know, you've made a commitment, you hired someone who lived in a HUBZone and they worked for you living in a HUBZone, but then the purpose of the program is to help make investments in these underutilized areas and people who live in those areas. So the program is actually working the way it's intended to work if that employee might decide to move out of a HUBZone at a later point. So there are a lot of good reasons behind this rule to let people qualify, you know, maintain their HUBZone employee status even after they move out of a HUBZone. But you have to satisfy these 3 specific requirements here on the slide. That each employee, if they're going to qualify as a legacy HUBZone employee, they have to live in a HUBZone for at least 180 days prior to your application or your certification date. They have to continue living in a HUBZone for at least 180 days after the same application or recertification date. It doesn't have to be the same HUBZone, but they have to have HUBZone residency for that entire 360-day period, 180 days before and after, whether it's your application or one of your recertification dates. And then they have to maintain uninterrupted employment with your company. And if they hit all 3 of those requirements, and if you're able to document it, then you can count that person as a legacy HUBZone employee for as long as they keep working for you. And if they leave, then you won't be able to count them as an employee anymore. If they don't work 40 hours in the relevant 4-week period, they wouldn't count as an employee. But as long as they keep working for you and they count as an employee, then you can count them as a HUBZone employee if you have met all 3 of these requirements. Now, since the rule went into effect, it's gotten a little bit less useful, I think, or I guess maybe I would say it's become harder to use than it was initially, because what SBA came out with FAQs in early 2020 on the new rules, and these FAQs said that you could use the legacy employee rule retroactively to any prior application or recertification date. So we had a lot of clients that went, you know, they had been in the HUBZone program for 10 years. And so they went back to prior certification dates and started determining who lived in a HUBZone for 180 days before and 180 days after that date and had maintained uninterrupted employment since then. And they started counting those people as legacy HUBZone employees. Well, then SBA came out with new guidance just a couple months ago. And from my perspective, they've significantly watered down the legacy employee provision, because now they say you can't use it retroactively. It only can be used for certification dates after the rules took effect in December 2019. So that really would mean 2020 annual recertification, you could have used it potentially, or you could use it potentially for this year's, at the time of this year's annual recertification. But you know, you won't quite qualify because you need 180 days before and 180 days after the certification date. So for anyone that you might be thinking of for this year's annual recertification, you're going to have to make sure they keep living in a HUBZone for 180 days after this year's recertification. So that definitely limits the applicability of the legacy employee provision. They also further limited it by, for the first time, saying that you can't use this for employees who live in redesignated areas or in qualified disaster areas. So, you know, that's also unfortunate. And as we'll talk about, the HUBZone map freeze has been extended. So areas that are redesignated right now are going to remain that way until June 2023 now. And I will talk more about that. So if you have employees that live in a redesignated area, you have no prospect that they will count as a legacy HUBZone employee anytime soon, or maybe ever. And same for qualified disaster areas. And another requirement that they imposed through this latest guidance, which I really struggle to understand, is you're not eligible to use this rule if your principal office is located in a redesignated area or a QDA. So this would be regardless of whether your employee is in a fully qualified HUBZone or not. If your principal office is in a redesignated area or a QDA, they won't let you take advantage of this rule either. And again, because the redesignated areas that are in place now have been extended till the end of June 2023, for those of you that have your principal office in a redesignated area, you don't have any prospect of using the legacy employee provision for several years, if ever. So I just wanted to make sure that you're all aware of this latest guidance. It has filtered its way into the program examinations that I know are going on, and that's really when we first got wind of it, when we started to see the way that the program examination forms were put together. So, if you have been counting on legacy employees because you relied in good faith on SBA's guidance from early 2020, it might be worth approaching SBA to talk with them about how you relied on that guidance and how it's going to affect you now that you're maybe no longer able to count certain people as legacy HUBZone employees. But if you haven't taken advantage of it yet, then just be aware that this is how it's changed, and you need to be careful on how you try to use the legacy employee provision going forward. As we let principal office load up here for you, I see we got a question. There are a lot of questions, so I probably will not be able to get to all of these at the end, but I'll respond to you all afterwards, and thank you for submitting. I see one that says, how do you show proof or documentation of an employee living at the address? I mean, the SBA will want to see the individual's driver's license, and it needs to be a current driver's license, so not one that's been expired. A lot of times though, employees don't have a driver's license that matches with their current address because maybe they don't need to update their driver's license for a while, and who wants to go to the DMV before you have to? So if the driver's license or a voter registration card aren't available or don't line up with the address, then you would provide a lease or a mortgage statement, maybe some utility bills, maybe a statement from the employee too. But really the lease or the mortgage statement should be the primary document if the driver's license doesn't work to establish where the person's living. All right, so principal office. We've been talking up to this point about the employee residency rules and the 20% versus the 35%. That's one of the big requirements for HUBZone eligibility. Another big requirement is around the principal office. So important to know how the principal office requirements are evolving here. And so the first bullet here just gives you the basic explanation from SBA of what is a principal office. And I want everyone to know that home offices count as office locations. If you have one of your employees working from home, that's going to be considered an office location with one employee. Or if you had a husband and wife, it would be a home office with two employees, or a mother and son. So when you are figuring out your office locations and who works where in this teleworking environment that's really accelerated over the last year and a half with COVID, obviously, more and more companies have people working from home, that you just need to know that that will be considered one of your office locations. And it might be an office of one. Most of the times it's just an office of one, because most of the time you don't have more than one family member as an employee, but you need to look at each home office as a separate office location and understand how many people are working from that location. If you are in the construction or in the services industry, then the SBA will not consider your job sites and people that work at your job sites. That's not part of the calculation of your principal office. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have contracts that with jobs that support the job site. So you can't just say I'm in the construction industry and these are job site employees. You need to be able to show here's contract number, blah, blah, blah with the Army Corps of Engineers, and it shows the job site location for this work. And that's where, the following people are spending most of their time working. And if you have employees that are not going to the same location all the time, maybe they come into the headquarters a little bit, but most of the time they're on the job site, then SBA is going to look at where the employee spends the majority of their time, 50% or more of their working time. Where is that location? And that's the office that they're going to be considered to work out of for purposes of determining the principal office. The principal office, you need to have activity there. That probably goes without saying, but just to emphasize it, it can't just be an office. You can't just hang a shingle and call it your principal office. You need to be doing work there. Obviously, it has to support the number of people who you claim are spending the majority of their time at that location. It needs to have the equipment, the office equipment and furniture and the square footage that's appropriate for the number of people that you say are working there. But it doesn't have to be your headquarters. So it doesn't have to be the most important company functions that are happening there. And I've given you an example here just to sort of drill home this point, that if you're in the services industry and you have two people working from their homes, and so what I'm saying here, their respective homes, I mean, one person's in one house, the other person's in another house, and then you have two people working from a location A and 10 people on job sites. Location A will be your principal office because location A has two people and the other two offices, which are home offices, only have one person working from each of them. Now I got a question here. What if there are two home employees and one at an office and 10 on the job site? Then the home office is going to be the principal office. If there's two people working from the same home, then that's going to be the principal office. Or let's change up the hypo again. Let's say one person working at home, one person working at location A, 10 people working on a job site. You don't have a principal office there because you have one and one. The principal office needs to be the place where you're doing where the greatest number of your employees perform their work. So if you need location A to be your principal office, you need to have one more person working in location A than works in any other office location. I'm going to spend a minute on shared office spaces because we have a lot of clients that use places like WeWorks. These shared office spaces have become very popular. And SBA has recently put in stricter guidance. So in many respects, I think they're kind of gutting the ability to use shared office space because they're now saying that you have to have a dedicated space. And to have a dedicated space means it can't be shared. It's only accessible to you, and it has to have a locked door. So really, you can't just use the communal spaces of a WeWorks type facility. You would have to be able to rent a dedicated space within that shared office in order to qualify a shared office as your principal office. So this guidance is also very, very new, just within the last 2 months. So if you're in a shared office space, you need to consider whether your arrangement will satisfy these requirements. The long-term investment rule, like the legacy employee rule, this is one of the new provisions that had a lot of promise when it was first implemented back in December 2019. The goal here is to give you certainty over your principal office location. And so if you make a long-term investment where you buy your building or you sign at least a 10-year lease in a HUBZone, then that location will remain HUBZone eligible for up to 10 years, even if it loses HUBZone status during that period. And so that's really huge. You know, again, we don't want firms to have the rug pulled out from under them when they decide to make an investment in an area, but then the map changes and that area is no longer HUBZone, and they're forced to pick up and move their office across town or sometimes across the street. So they're trying to give more certainty, and I think, you know, that was a very good change. Unfortunately, in practice, it looks like it's also getting watered down like the legacy employee provision, because the early guidance in 2020 indicated you could use this retroactively, just like the legacy employee provision could be used retroactively, but they've now walked that back. So as of May, you cannot use this retroactively. It only applies if you bought your building, bought your office, or signed a 10-year or more lease after December 26, 2019. It's also not available if your principal office is in a redesignated area or a QDA when you make the certification or annual recertification. So for those companies that are in redesignated areas, you cannot use this, and you won't be able to use it, you know, maybe ever, at a minimum, not until after June 30, 2023. You also cannot use this if you're in a shared office space, so that they will not let that type of office qualify. So what this QDA conundrum, the qualified disaster area, you know, in October 2020, SBA told everyone that if your principal office was in a qualified disaster area, it would qualify for this 10-year long-term investment rule if you signed a long-term lease or bought your building. And then SBA changed that guidance a few months later in around March 2021. And unfortunately, a number of firms that we know made decisions about their principal office location, including entering into a long-term lease based on the belief that it would qualify for the 10-year long-term investment rule. So it does not. The SBA has clearly said now, you cannot qualify for this 10-year rule by making a long-term investment in an area that is a QDA. So just know that going forward. If you are a firm that relied on that guidance at some point between October and March in entering into a long-term lease or buying a building or making some other critical decision about your office space, then I think you should reach out to SBA to talk about your specific situation and see if there might be any flexibility that they'd be willing to afford to you. Speaking of flexibility, there has been flexibility in place since last year for COVID for the principal office requirement, and what you have to show is up on the slide here. If you can demonstrate that you were meeting the principal office requirement before COVID, but then because of COVID, you required your people to telework, and you're expecting that they will come back when the telework is over, they'll come back to the principal office and you're able to give them meaningful work in the meantime, then you can meet the principal office requirement even though you may not have people working out of the principal office if they're teleworking because of COVID. But it's important that this is mandatory telework that qualifies for this. So now that we're starting to get to the point where, you know, I keep hearing businesses are slowly reopening. I hear a lot of people talk about after Labor Day, they're going back, or there's some modified form of going back and teleworking. if you get to a point where teleworking is no longer mandatory for your employees and they're allowed to choose whether to come back or not, you may not qualify for this flexibility anymore. So keep that in mind, that it's supposed to be mandatory telework. And if you hired employees after the pandemic started and they would have worked in your principal office, if you were allowed to work in the principal office and they were teleworking because of COVID, and if you can show that they will go into the principal office once you reopen it, then you can count those new hires as principal office workers too. The COVID guidance, this flexibility is in place through September 30, 2021. So we're coming into the home stretch. It's possible that SBA will extend that. I haven't heard anything, so I'm just saying, not much there, because it's possible they won't extend it either. But considering that the Delta variant and what you hear in the news, that there's reason still to be cautious. We're not out of the wood. The pandemic isn't over. We're just in a better phase of it, fortunately. So we'll have to see if SBA extends the COVID flexibilities past the end of September. For right now, if you have an annual recertification coming up in October or later, you should be planning that you're not going to be able to use the COVID flexibilities when you recertify. I mentioned the extension of the HUBZone map freeze before, so I'll just drill down a little bit about that now. As you may know, a few years ago, they froze the HUBZone maps until the end of 2021. The idea was, let's get the 2020 census results and let's make sure that we know what the new boundaries are going to look like, and then everybody can have enough time to plan, because there was what's called the census cliff after the 2010 census, where a lot of companies left the HUBZone program in part because of changes to the maps based on the census. So they didn't want that to happen again. They froze the maps, but then COVID happened, and of course, things are not on schedule because of what's been going on. So they proposed a rule a couple months ago to extend that freeze, and then that rule took effect last month. So the freeze has now been extended from the end of this year to June 30, 2023. And I think SBA believes that this will give them enough time to get the census data, which is delayed, and then they can update the maps, and then this will give HUBZone businesses enough time to plan, knowing what the new maps will look like. So if you are in a redesignated area right now, there will be no change to your area at the end of this year. It's going to stay HUBZone eligible until the end of June 2023. And that means the same for census tracts, qualified non-metropolitan counties. There won't be any new or any removals of those types of HUBZone areas. It's not going to affect the addition or removal of QDAs and Indian reservations or governor designated covered areas, and it won't affect the addition of new qualified base closure areas. They won't take away any existing qualified base closure areas. So for the most part, maps are frozen for another year and a half, which means that we all will have certainty for that much longer about what is and is not HUBZone. And the last few slides here, in the few minutes we have left, I want to talk about the application and the annual, the program exam processes, what we've been seeing from the new rules and how they've been doing them. So the rules indicate that they're supposed to make their decision on a HUBZone application within 60 calendar days after they have a completed application. So if your initial application isn't complete, that wouldn't start the 60-day clock. You're supposed to tell SBA if there are any material changes that affect your eligibility while they're processing the application. You have to make sure that it's an owner or an officer that makes all certifications related to your application, and there's going to be no reconsideration process. So if you are denied your application, you just simply have to reapply, and you can reapply in 90 days. So I think that's the reason that they decided against a reconsideration process, because it'll be relatively quick turnaround for when you can reapply. Program exams, the SBA can do at any time, and where they have a reason to reach out to you to question your status. This could also happen in the midst of processing your application. They might reach out and say they want to explore a particular issue with you, or when you're in the midst of being in the program, they might conduct a program exam. What's happening this year is that they're conducting full document reviews as program exams for companies that were due for their full document review. The full document review is supposed to happen every 3 years. And for a lot of firms, maybe 2020 was that third year, but because most firms deferred their recertification, those reviews are happening now. So we have a number of clients that did their annual recertification earlier this year, and then a few months later, SBA reached out to them to initiate a program exam. And the program exam is requiring the HUBZone firm to provide all the documents to show that they're continuing to be eligible. So basically, when you do the annual recertification, it's kind of a check the box type situation where you're annually recertifying, yes, I am still eligible, but then SBA, when it's your time, SBA is going to follow up with you to say, all right, show us all the documents to confirm that you're still eligible. And that's the type of program exam that a lot of our clients are going through right now. So if that's going to be you, or if that is you right now, then these are the types of documents that SBA is requiring. They have come up with a spreadsheet that's a little bit confusing at first, and you don't have to use it. You can use your own spreadsheet, but they want an Excel spreadsheet to track your firm location, your office locations, and your employees, so they can clearly see, who you have, where they work, who's living in a HUBZone, that kind of stuff. They're going to want to look at your lease and utility bill to confirm your principal office location, and obviously your payroll records. And we've talked about the relevant 4-week period. That's the period that they need payroll for. Proof of HUBZone residency, I mentioned that in response to the question, that they're going to want your driver's licenses for your HUBZone employees, and maybe also lease or something else if you don't have a driver's license and your HUBZone map. So, and there are several instances when you need to provide sworn statements from your employees. So just be on the lookout that you might need to go to your employees, depending on the circumstances, and ask them to provide a statement that will support your submission to SBA. They also have very specific naming conventions for how they want you to name the files, and then you upload them. So we're doing a lot right now of helping companies look over their submissions before they go into SBA, and to flag potential issues, because we do seem to have a lot of companies that are going through these full document program exams right now. And then when they're doing a program exam, they should decide if you're going to remain eligible for the program or not within 90 calendar days. And then if they decide you're not eligible, they will propose you for decertification from the program and give you 30 days to respond, or they will let you voluntarily decertify from the program. So depending on what their findings are, if you don't agree with their findings, then you have the ability to go back and say, I think you made a mistake, or I want you to consider this information, and essentially ask them to reconsider why they think you should be removed from the program. Or if you realize you made a mistake and the SBA's analysis was correct and you're not eligible, then you can voluntarily decertify, and then you would have to wait 90 days, and you could apply again if you wanted to, and if you would be able to meet the requirements. Also want you to maintain your records related to the program exams for 6 years. So that's just make sure you hang on to the documents that you submit to SBA. All right, and that's the end of the presentation here, landing just before 3, I got several questions at the end here about the slides. Yes, the slides will be made available. I will ask my friends with the NVSBC if they will be able to send those out to all the participants here. If they don't, then PilieroMazza will. But one way or the other, we'll make sure that everybody that joined today gets a copy of the slides. And then I know there were a bunch of questions that I wasn't able to answer. Some of them are pretty specific to the questionnaire situation. So I'll follow up with each of you individually as soon as I can. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Hey, John, thank you very much for this amazing presentation. Again, so we will send everybody the slides and a copy of the presentation today. So that will be sent out next week. So again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, John, again for supporting the NVSBC and the HUBZone Council. We appreciate all the hard work you do for small business. So again, everybody, thank you, and we will see you next time. Take care.